We Christians believe some things that if you're not a follower of Jesus, you may consider ridiculous. And to be honest, Christians believe some things that when life gets difficult, well, we sometimes have a hard time believing them ourselves. Today in this special Easter edition of Journey at Home, I want to talk about the tension that can create for all of us. So thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell for notifications. And let's just jump right in, because there are a lot of Christian beliefs that I would say they're easy to question or they're easy to doubt. For instance, we believe God's all-powerful and He's immensely personal. Well, that's hard to believe, because would a God so big really care about our stuff that's so small? We believe God hears all of our prayers. But again, there are so many people in the world. I'm supposed to believe He's listening to me. And then why are there times when it feels like my prayers are ignored, like they're bouncing off the ceiling? We believe God's for us. But if God's for me, why do so many bad things happen to me? I mean, wouldn't He protect me from all of that? We believe God has a purpose for our lives. But how do you believe that when life seems so random and we can't make sense of anything happening to us? We believe God will make everything right one day in eternity. In other words, when we die, we believe it's not the end, that everybody lives forever somewhere. And for those of us who have a relationship with Jesus, we believe that's the beginning of a life without any sin, sorrow, or death. But how do you know? I mean, it feels like this life is really all there is, and that's what matters most. It'll be all I care about. But as hard as all of those things are to believe, I don't think any of them compare with our belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. Are you kidding me? I mean, what do dead people do? Yeah, they stay dead, right? We have centuries of history and cemeteries full of evidence to prove it. I mean, how can any rational person believe a dead man walked out of a tomb on his own? Well, if you've ever doubted that, if you've ever questioned that, I totally understand. If you think it's crazy for any of us to believe that, I see where you're coming from. But today, I want to give you just a few of the pieces of evidence. Now, not beliefs. This isn't about having blind faith, but a reasonable, logical, evidential case for why Christians are confident in what we know. And it all starts with this idea. If you can prove the resurrection did not happen, then there is no point in holding on to anything we believe. In fact, if you can prove the resurrection isn't true, I wish you'd let me in on it, because I'm going to go find another line of work, okay? And I'm not the only one who has thought that. The Apostle Paul, who wrote many of the New Testament documents, in a letter to the Corinthians, he said to them, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, so's your faith." That's pretty blunt, isn't it? If the resurrection didn't happen, Paul says, everything I'm doing is useless. I'm wasting my life. And oh, by the way, if you're a Christian, your faith's worthless too. I mean, if you can disprove the resurrection, listen, you shouldn't try to keep the good parts. Are you kidding me? Y'all just throw it all away. But if you can prove the resurrection happened, well, now that's a different story. You better take seriously everything Jesus said if that's true. So if we were having coffee and you asked me about the resurrection, I would tell you the evidence points to it being an historical event, not a religious belief. For example, one of the pieces of evidence that I would point you to is how Jesus' first followers acted and reacted, both before and then during and then after the death and resurrection of Jesus, because what you find is there is a dramatic and unexplainable change in their behavior. For instance, Peter was a follower who, during the trials of Jesus, denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus. But then after the resurrection, Peter was arrested by the very people who had Jesus murdered, and he looks them in the eye when they're threatening him, and he says, "Oh, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we're witnesses of this." Now, where did that courage come from for Peter? I mean, how did he go from being a coward to being so bold unless something significant had happened? And eventually, if you don't know Peter's story, he was tortured and killed later on in life because he wouldn't recant that he had seen a resurrected Jesus. And we have similar stories about Peter's brother Andrew, and about Matthew, and about the brothers James and John, and about Thomas and all the other disciples, and even Jesus' own brother, James. They were all tortured and most killed because they wouldn't deny what they had seen and experienced with their own eyes. That Jesus was crucified, He was buried, and then He came back to life. I'll give you another reason why we believe the resurrection is a historical event. It's actually Emperor Nero. So Nero became emperor of Rome at the age of 16. Imagine that. He got his driver's license and control of the empire on the same day. That's probably pretty wild. And then in 64 AD, 30 years after the resurrection, Nero, you may remember, decides to burn down Rome. And as you probably know, at that point there were enough Jesus followers in Rome who believed in the resurrection that Nero was able to blame them for what he did. Now, here's why that's so significant. Do you know how long sociologists say it takes for any type of made-up legend to spread and to be accepted by a large group of people? Well, it takes about 60 to 80 years. That's because everybody who witnessed what actually happened and can refute the legend, well, there has to be enough time for them to all die in order for the legend to stick. But just 30 years after Jesus' resurrection, there are already thousands of people throughout the Roman Empire who believe he walked out of a tomb under his own power. It is hard to spin a story like that with eyewitnesses still around. One more compelling piece of evidence I want to highlight is the account of the women who discovered the empty tomb and first saw Jesus alive. Now, here's why this matters. If you went to court in the first century and you called a woman as a witness, everybody would just laugh because women had zero credibility in that culture. They weren't allowed to testify. So the reason I bring that up is because if I'm trying to fool first century people into believing a story that I have made up, I would never include women as the central eyewitnesses for me in the story. But all four accounts of the resurrection say women were the first to find the empty tomb, they were the first to see Jesus, and they were the first to tell the men that the tomb was empty. In John's account, he tells us that early on the first day of the week while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb with her other female friend. She saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And so what did she do? She came running back to Simon Peter and John, and she said to them, well, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they put him. This isn't a woman who saw a stone rolled away and assumed, oh, wow, an angel moved that. Jesus is alive. It's happening just like we thought. No. Mary Magdalene assumed what any of us would have assumed. She assumed someone had decided to move his body. Maybe his enemies had stolen his body, but she never assumed he was alive. She's so upset and confused. And now she tells John and Peter this, and they're so confused. So they run to the tomb as fast as they can. They peek inside. They see these strips of linen that Jesus' body had been wrapped in. They're just lying there where his body had been placed. And then guess what Peter and John do? They go right back home because it doesn't make any sense to them. If you're making this story up, you don't write yourself into the story reacting that way. You might write yourself into the story going, oh yeah, we knew all along he was coming out of that tomb. And by the way, for $99.99, we can let you meet him, You write it in that way. But they don't do that. And who can blame them? Because who expects a dead man to come back to life? Well, meanwhile, John tells us that Mary, after Peter and John leave the tomb, Mary's still standing outside the tomb and she's crying. She's crying because she doesn't know what happened to the body. And as she's crying, she bends over to look into the tomb. She sees two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been. One of them was at the head, one of them was at the foot. And these angels ask her, well, woman, why are you crying? She's like, well, they've taken my Lord away. I don't know where they put him. In other words, somebody took the body. And then something happens that I think she laughed about every time she told it. John tells us that she then turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. Maybe it was still too dark to see well. Maybe he was standing far away. Maybe he's behind her and, she's bawling, so she notices somebody's there but doesn't pay attention to who it is. But she doesn't recognize Jesus. It's a little embarrassing, right? And I think Jesus probably chuckled in that moment because he looks at her and he says, woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? And John says, thinking he was the gardener, Mary said, sir, if you've carried him away, just tell me where you put him and I'll get him. Can you imagine years later she's telling this story and she's like, oh yeah, Jesus showed up and I thought he was just there to weed the flower bed. I didn't know it was him. But again, who can blame her? Nobody expected nobody in the tomb. Nobody expected a resurrection. So in that moment, Jesus looks at her and he just says, Mary. And the minute she hears his voice, she knows. She turned toward him, she cried out, she said, teacher, teacher. And then Mary Magdalene went to the disciples and gave them the news. She said, I've seen the Lord, he's alive. And she told them that Jesus had said all those things to her. So why does all that matter? What's the big deal? Why is it worth examining all the evidence? I'll tell you why. It matters because the resurrection is what gives us confidence. It validates what Jesus taught. You can trust everything Jesus said because he rose from the dead. Now, if he didn't rise from the dead, you actually shouldn't trust anything he said. But he predicted his own death and resurrection as he was claiming to be God. And then he validated his claims by coming back to life. That is a game changer. So if you're a follower of Jesus and you find yourself in one of those moments where, the circumstances of life are creating doubt in your mind that God's personal, or that he cares about you, that he sees you, that he hears you, that he has a plan for you. Listen, whenever doubt starts to shout at you, all you have to do is pause. Just go back to the resurrection. Because if Jesus walked out of that tomb, you don't have to wonder about whether he'll keep his promises to you. The resurrection is the anchor for your faith. You can trust everything Jesus said because he rose from the dead. Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus, here's what I would invite you to do. I would just invite you to examine all the evidence. I'm happy to help. Our church is happy to help. We can point you in the right direction. We can guide you along the way and let you discover for yourself where the evidence leads. But it's worth you putting in the effort. Because what if, just think about this, what if all of this really is true? How much better would life be knowing there's a God who cares about you personally, a God who's for you, a God who hears your prayers, who doesn't abandon you, who offers forgiveness to you unconditionally? What if you knew you were created on purpose for a purpose think about, that would change your life. I know, because it's changed mine. So I want to invite you to explore and to trust, but not trust blindly, to trust the evidence, not trust religious beliefs, trust the evidence. And if you've examined and explored and you're ready to trust, well, man, today is a great day for you to take the first step in following Jesus. You can just tell God right now, wherever you are, hey, Jesus, I give you my life. I want a relationship with you, the one who died and rose again to pay for my sins. And then trust him enough to follow him the rest of your life. Because after all, he's trustworthy. You can trust everything he said because he rose from the dead. Happy Easter.